if you are planting a native plant garden, you are planting all of these resources, and then in the winter, you're raking up their overwintering habitat, you could be, actually kind of causing harm.
In today's episode, we're talking with Dr. Max Ferlauto. He is the state entomologist for the Maryland Natural Heritage Program. We'll be talking about his research on the science behind leaving your leaves, which shows just how big of a difference this one simple step can make, not only for the insects and spiders in your yard, but also for your soil health. Stick around to the end of the conversation to learn how to request the bonus content that I created for this episode, summarizing Max's research and providing some actionable steps that you can take in your own yard. Hi, Max. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey, how are you doing?
Doing well. And I am so excited to have you on today and to talk with you because your research is really some of the first to actually quantify just how much of a difference leaving our leaves can make. But before we jump into your research itself, can you tell us a little bit about what inspires you to actually study this from a scientific standpoint?
Well, I was really interested in the idea that leaves offer more to the ecosystem than just being a use for decomposing taxa of insects. I like the idea that, just because it's on the ground, it's affecting everything else, even up into the trees. And, at least where I am, fall is a huge time of year. Tons of leaves are falling. People are raking leaves, jumping in the leaf piles. It's like a big component to the community here. And I started to see these signs. People would say, leave your leaves, leave your leaves. And that was really interesting to me. And the work that my PhD lab does is all about preserving biodiversity in urban, suburban places. So this was a really great question to try and hone down because you'd see all these signs, but yeah, as you said, we didn't really have any quantifiable evidence that showed leaving your leaves was a beneficial management.
Yeah, I mean, intuitively, it makes sense. I mean, we can dig through the leaf
Intuitively, it
piles.
does, yes.
Yeah, we can find the stuff, but that doesn't give us the scientific data. That doesn't tell us, does this really make a difference in the big scale?
Right. And being able to have this data means, first of all, we can approach legislatively different issues, right? Because now we actually have the science to back up these things. And it also means that we have a way to really understand how, if we need to, we can improve our conservation. So to be able to ask, kind of detailed questions means that we can relay information that is highly accurate.
Yes, and this is something that we can all do as well. I mean, it's very applicable to our real lives.
Absolutely. And that's what's exciting. This is something that we can, really all backyard conservation is. These are things that we can do, we can change ourselves, and that's always exciting.
Yes, exactly. So, can you tell us a little bit about your research?
Sure, yeah. So what was really cool was there was a lot of people interested in this work. So I was able to actually conduct a lot of these experiments in people's backyards. So that was another thing that was cool. We're actually measuring the ecological value of pieces of land in people's backyards. And ultimately, what the research consisted of, kind of across the different sites, was we used these things called emergence traps, which are basically these tents, these cages that collect everything that emerges from the ground within a certain, for us, it was about a meter squared. And it collects it in this collection bottle, and then we can replace that collection bottle every couple of weeks and count and identify all the things emerging. And our treatments were areas where you leave your leaves and areas where you remove your leaves. And that was a manipulation that I would do. So in the fall, I would go to a home and I would set up these plots, which were right next to each other. one where I'd remove the leaves and one where the leaves were retained. And then in the spring, I'd place those emergence traps on top and collect everything that was emerging.
And that's one of the things that I think is really cool about your project too, is that this wasn't just done in a lab or something like this. This was done on people's yards with all the complications that come with
Yeah,
using people's yards. Like everyone's different. But I mean, this is real life. This was actually looking at what happens in somebody's yard when when you remove the
exactly.
leaves.
Yeah. And there's some things that, so we also had a kind of a secondary study that was in a more controlled forested ecosystem where we could change lots of different things like the tree species and things like that, and we could add additional treatments and use more equipment. But um, ultimately, it was really great to be able to, um, do the experiment where people do remove their leaves.
So with these emergence traps, you're just looking at insects with that, correct? It wasn't like salamanders or any other critters that might be using the leaves.
No, unfortunately, the emergence trap does kill the insects, so it's actually a good thing that we were not getting, salamanders and things like that. Um, but that is definitely of interest, because we hear about all the other, amphibians and such that use the leaf litter as well. The emergence traps is primarily used for insects that fly out of the ground. Um, so they're really handy to assess things that aren't spending their entire life cycle within the leaves. They're moving on to an arboreal system a little bit later in their lives. And that's kind of a new area of research for leaf litter manipulation studies. Usually, leaf litter manipulation studies look at decomposer taxa, and microbes and things like that.
So that would be your millipedes, your little springtails.
Earthworms, exactly, absolutely.
What were some of the insects that you did see emerging out of the leaves?
So we focused on butterflies and moths, flies, beetles, spiders, and parasitic wasps. Those were kind of um, our orders that we identified to. Of course, spiders aren't insects. And then we identified even further to species and family for the Lepidoptera and the parasitic wasps, because those were taxa that are very important for home gardeners. Um, Butterflies, especially their caterpillars, or really moths and their caterpillars, are a huge resource for breeding birds. And parasitic wasps are really useful as natural enemies, biocontrol for garden pests. So those were kind of the taxa that we were really focused on.
So, what were some of the differences? What did you discover?
So I think one of the coolest things that we found was just how alive a backyard is. We think, oh, it's got grass on it, it's been mowed, it's just this dead area. And that's not really the case. We found almost 2,000 insects and spiders in a square meter of backyard. That's if you leave your leaves. And of that, we found about 20 butterfly or moth individuals. We found almost 300 parasitic wasps, over 100 spiders, almost 400 beetles, over 1,000 flies. So these are really, abundant areas in our yards. But unfortunately, that they rely on that habitat of the fallen leaves. So when you remove your leaves, we found that butterflies and moths, their abundance was reduced by about 45%. Spiders were reduced by 56%. Beetles were reduced by 24%. So, these large numbers are unfortunately drastically being reduced when you remove your leaves. Some other interesting things we found were, we looked at the diversity of the emerging species, And we found that removing leaves reduced butterfly and moth emergence by about 44%. So we have not only are the numbers being reduced, but also the richness, the species richness, and the diversity. The other interesting thing was we looked at the community composition, or like not just how many species, but what types of species. And we found that, overall, there were certain traits that were more affected than others. So uh, if you're a butterfly or moth and your feeding habit is to be a leaf miner, to like feed in between leaves, you are more highly affected by leaf removal. If you had a life history trait of overwintering within the leaves, you were more affected. If your life history trait was to overwinter as larvae, you were more affected. And what was cool is we found uh, kind of a match on the food chain as well. So we found that the parasitic wasps, and parasitic wasps feed on insects. They parasitize them, right? So we found that the parasitic wasps that were most affected were those that parasitized leaf miners, or that parasitized larval caterpillars. So it was kind of cool to see, like, okay, the reductions in the prey also led to reductions in the predators or the parasites.
Right. It's all connected. That's perfect example of that.
Absolutely.
So, can you give us some examples of specific butterflies or moths or beetles that people might recognize that were there maybe in the ones that left the leaves, but then were pretty much missing or completely missing that we tended to lose when you remove the leaves?
Well, on the East Coast, a lot of people are familiar with woolly bear caterpillars. Yeah, you have them there as well. I think there's like different traditions about like the length of their coloration and how long winter will be. And you see them all along the roads now. So people are fairly familiar with woolly bear caterpillars. And they are one of the species that overwinters within the leaf litter. And then they do that as a caterpillar. So they'll basically freeze um, in the winter. So that's one. There are some other like moths in the same family that do the same thing. Adult butterflies actually also have been found to overwinter in leaf litter. Here we have morning cloak butterflies, um, question marks or commas as well are butterflies that can do that. And we also have all of our, large, beautiful moths like the polyphemus moth and the luna moth. Um, so those are, I guess, would be some of like the macro moths that maybe people are more aware of that rely on that type of overwintering habitat.
Did you see a difference in lightning bugs?
This is interesting. We really didn't have too many lightning bugs, and I wonder if that's just unfortunately due to where we're in heavy suburbia over here, and there just might not have been that many to begin with. But that was something that initially we wanted to quantify, but we just weren't getting enough for it to make sense.
Where exactly did you do this research at?
Yeah, so I went to University of Maryland, and so the kind of the research zone was between Washington D.C. and Baltimore. It was kind of that stretch. So we had fairly suburban homes, and they kind of ran the gambit of more suburban to more urban. But these were all areas where leaves would fall from the trees and be raked. And then we had another study that we did at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, and that was in a project called the Biodiversity Tree Project, which is a planted experiment where they planted trees in different levels of diversity. And kind of the thinking there was, with what I'm trying to been getting at is that there's been a lot of research on the active life cycles of insects. We know to plant native host plants. We know to provide flowering resources, nectar resources. But there really has not been too much research on these more inactive stages. And, one possibility was that if you are planting a native plant garden, you are planting all of these resources, and then in the winter, you're raking up their overwintering habitat, you could be, actually kind of causing harm. And so that was, in ecology, we think of this as a population sink or an ecological trap where insects think an area is really great, but then they're not able to, continue their population there. So that was an idea I was thinking about. Okay, how does diversity interact with these leaf management strategies? And so there we were able to manipulate tree diversity. And we did a lot of other things too. We looked at temperature, we looked at soil moisture, we looked at additional management strategies, so like creating leaf piles, or like mulching or shredding your leaves, which is another common tactic. So those were the two sites that we used.
That's something else that really brought up a bunch of different points here that I think are so important because, yes, when we talk about creating habitat in our yards and on our property, so often we are talking about, or at least thinking about, what do I plant? How do I have those pretty flowers? And like you said, those active life cycle time periods. And especially in the case of the insects, we forget that they don't all fly away and then just magically go poof, find back in the spring.
Yeah,
Um, we have to provide those year long, those all year long, throughout the entire life cycle, habitats for them. And that means even when we can't see them or
yep,
see them as easily.
absolutely.
Yeah, so that's really very important. Like I said, that's one of the reasons I really liked your research because it quantifies that when it comes to the leaves. But yeah, I was kind of curious too, if there was differences in what you saw, like if people had more trees versus fewer trees in their yard, or uh, different types of trees in their yard versus having the kind of traditional one or two sugar maples. So it's just the one type of tree in there. And it sounds like even if you didn't get into that with the actual yard settings, that you might have been able to touch upon some of that and the experimental station.
Right, exactly. And that was the reason we did the experimental plots at the forested site, because um, it's just really hard to control for all of those things in suburban areas. But I guess I can say that just in thinking about suburban areas first, what we also looked at were kind of management traditions. So in an area where leaves, in like a high maintenance area where leaves had been removed year after year, generally turf grass, front yards, ornamental plantings. We compared those areas and leaf litter management techniques in those areas compared to like behind your house, behind your shed. Your leaves have been left there year after year. It's a more unmaintained area. And what was interesting is we actually saw the greatest benefit to leaving your leaves in areas where there really wasn't any of those leaf resources. So the front yards, the areas that we kind of usually think of as not being as good for insects because it's all turf grass and non-native plantings, those actually were the areas that benefited the most. And what we're thinking is it's because we're adding a resource that hadn't been there before. So in that kind of desert of habitat, all of a sudden there's like a pile of leaves and the insects get excited about that. They move into that area. So we do think there's probably some, prioritization of habitat locations that the insects are moving towards, and also what backyard or land managers, homeowners can prioritize where they're going to change their habits. In terms of trees themselves, in this other study that we did, where we were able to look at tree species and things like that, we really didn't actually see much differences between tree diversity and the insects that were emerging. And that's interesting because we were finding differences in the active life cycle stages. So we found that in areas that are more diverse, there are more abundant caterpillar populations and the communities are more diverse. And we weren't finding that kind of below ground. And the other question we had was, well, maybe by planting a diverse canopy, instead of it acting as a population sink, instead it's basically buffering against the negative effects of removing leaves. In other words, there's this idea of like biological insurance, where if you have a lot of different species, they'll do different things and they'll kind of all fit together in a puzzle so that uh, they're more resilient to disturbance. So, like, for example, if you have a monoculture of trees where they're all the same species, and we would say that, and what our studies have found was that there are fewer species of caterpillars that feed on that monoculture. You know, less diverse trees, less diverse insects. You can also think about less diverse traits or functional traits of these insects. So, because you have fewer species, together they have not very diverse overwintering life histories. So, you could say there's a chance that most of them overwinter in the leaf litter. But if you have a polyculture or a diverse tree assemblage and you have a diverse insect assemblage, you likely also have diverse overwintering traits. So some of the insects will overwinter within the leaf litter, but maybe some overwinter below ground and are more protected against, raking or blowing leaves. So our idea was like, okay, well, maybe by planting a diverse tree canopy, it is a kind of buffer to the negative effects of our leaf management. Now we didn't find that, but that was the hypothesis that we had. What we did find is that abiotic factors were buffered. So across both, and what I mean by it is like non-living factors were affected. So across both experiments, we found that by removing leaves, you are basically taking off like that blanket from the soil. And so the temperatures of the soil, they're going to go up and down a lot more. They're going to have high variability. And when leaves are preserved, that variability is a lot smaller. And that variability can be dangerous for an insect that's overwintering. For that woolly bear caterpillar who's frozen solid, if it's thawing and then freezing again and then thawing again, that can reduce its health in the long run. Um, the other thing we found was that there was a difference in the variation in moisture levels as well. So when you remove your leaves, your variation in soil moisture goes up and down a lot more. So the leaves are acting really as this buffer to moisture and temperature of the soil. And it turns out so is a diverse canopy. And what we think is happening is the way the trees grow in polycultures or in mixtures, they kind of like fill together and they form almost the same sort of blanket that the leaves are on the forest floor. Their branches are intertwining and they're kind of filling out different parts of the understory. And that is kind of reducing temperature variation and reducing moisture variation. So there is definitely benefits to the diverse canopy, to these kind of baseline abiotic factors of our ecosystems.
That's interesting. That's really interesting because I would have been like you more like you originally thought. More diversity of the plants gives you more diversity of the insects using them because you got different host plants there. So therefore that should translate to more diversity in the leaf litter.
Yeah, and we're we're still working on this data. We haven't published it yet. So there's a chance that as we continue to analyze, we'll see some, interesting things that might kind of help explain the overall pattern.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing that paper get published because I want to dig more into that.
Yeah, I'm working on it.
Yeah, because there's so many questions there that I want to ask, and I know there's if you're still analyzing the data, you don't have the answers yet and probably won't have the answers because this sounds like one of those situations where it's very likely to be the more questions we answer, the more questions we get sort of
Yeah.
deal.
Yeah.
Hmm.
What we do know though is that we have a sense of what the alternative litter management strategies uses are. So, in addition to removing and retaining leaves, we also piled leaves and
Mhm.
we shredded leaves. And we found that uh, shredding leaves is not a good solution. We found the numbers of insects emerging from shredded leaves is basically the same amount as emerging from the removed treatment. Um, and that kind of makes sense because you're shredding them.
Yeah, that makes sense, and, yeah, I've had people tell me, "Oh, I shred my leaves, so
Right.
that's okay," and I'm like, "You're running all the critters that were in the leaf litter through the shredder?"
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
but and when I say it that way, they're like, "Oh, yeah," but
Yeah.
again, this gives us the data that we actually know that, yeah, that's the case.
But piling leaves was a good alternative. So if you have to take your leaf litter and move it to another area in your yard, for the most part, you're preserving the insects that are within that leaf litter. And we think a good number, at least, you know, in suburban areas, are overwintering within the leaf litter itself. And so by moving those leaves to another area, you can preserve them. There's this idea of soft landings under your trees to not, rake or disturb those areas. But if you also want to move leaves from your turf grass to those areas under your trees, that is a great solution because not everybody can leave their leaves,
Or they can't leave all of the
all
leaves,
of them,
so
exactly.
right, this gives you options, which is good because as homeowners, we need options because we don't have cookie cutter situations or homes or in properties, anything like that. So we need to have some options that still work. So with that and the leaf piles, um, how deep? Did you look at that?
We did not. So we basically just doubled the amount of leaves. Um, so I would say that really that's what we're thinking about here. We're thinking about like a doubling of leaves, not nothing more, because the more leaves that you have, like if you think about a leaf pile, let's say it rains on your leaf pile, you could really be kind of cutting off all oxygen to the stuff in the bottom, and then they can't breathe and they'll die. It also makes it harder for them to um, get a sense of their own internal cycles. And so they won't know when it's time to get out or to emerge from hibernation. And even if they do figure that out, they've got such a long way to go that they'll exhaust themselves getting out. And those things are actually really important when you're the size of,
Yeah, when you're a caterpillar or butterfly or
yeah,
fly or
that energy
parasitic
that you
wasp.
have is very limited. So you want to use it as best you can. So I would say, uh, you know, I wouldn't go deeper than like 6 inches or so.
And that makes sense. And even just thinking about it as, like you referred to before, a blanket. By the time you add on too many blankets or too thick of a
Yeah,
blanket, if we want to put it
exactly.
into our terms, it just you get too hot. So
Yeah,
again, going back to the it's going to make it harder for them to get the signals that they need
right,
to be
right.
able to say, yeah, it's time to come out.
Mhm.
And yeah, going back a little bit to what you were talking about earlier with the greater difference being made when you took an area that didn't have leaves and then you left the leaves on it. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense too, just intuitively thinking, because, like you said, you're adding a resource that wasn't there. It's essentially the winter version of us planting a native plant garden and adding those native plants for the nectar and the pollen resources in the spring and summer.
Yeah, absolutely. And that kind of gives you a sense of where to prioritize leaving your leaves. If you already have an area that's like behind your house and isn't very maintained, it's kind of already functioning as best it can. It's those areas that are more maintained, like in your front yard or maybe in your ornamental garden, that you can actually do the most benefit. That being said, you don't have to all of a sudden leave all your leaves in your front yard. But if you preserve a small section of them, here we're just looking at a meter squared. That's where, our research was on. We had 2,000, insects emerging from a meter squared, just of the groups that we measured. That's not counting like springtails or anything, or grasshoppers or anything. So, you know, doing a little bit is still doing a lot.
And that's not saying, okay, so it doesn't matter, I can go out and rake my backyard that I wasn't raking before.
No, yeah,
This is doing something in addition to.
right.
It really helps. So, how long do those benefits last?
So surprisingly fast. So like if you had an area where you like a high maintained area in your front yard where it's like turf grass and everything, and then you leave your leaves for a year, you increased butterfly and moth emergence by like 84%. So that's just a single year. The changes happen very quick because, for the most part, they're up there waiting to try and find a place to overwinter. And then if you provide it, they will benefit.
Yeah, that's great to know too, because sometimes it feels like it can take so long for a difference to happen, and this is like 84%. That's pretty huge in 1 year.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we found, because we also did research on soil health, and it was in that research that we found that it actually took a really long time to improve your soil. So, kind of the foundation for that research was thinking about how removing leaves year after year affected the long-term storage of carbon in our urban soils. And carbon, everybody's talking about carbon. It's so important just based on its chemistry. um, the more organic matter you have in the soil, the easier it is for plants to uptake nutrients. You have greater water holding capacity, so water doesn't just flush or run off right off of your soil. It can be held within. So there's so many benefits to carbon. And it's interesting in kind of where I got this idea was in some parts of the world, leaf litter and debris are harvested to use in agricultural uses. So, like for animal bedding or different things like that. And those are, in more subsistence communities. But in the medieval ages, it was a huge custom to go out into the forests of Europe and rake the forest floor to use as animal bedding. And research has shown that that activity, hundreds of years ago, although the activity is over, nobody's raking European forests anymore, but the carbon within the soil is still reduced. So it's basically this what we call legacy effect. That even after hundreds of years after this raking practice has ceased, we're still seeing effects in the soil. And so that's what got me thinking, like, okay, well, some of these yards, I mean, we're not talking about hundreds of years, but there are some homes that are 100 years old, 50 years old, especially in these, planned suburban areas. They presumably have been raked for, 50
Decades.
years, decades. Yeah. So I wanted to look at the legacy effects of that leaf litter raking on soil carbon and decomposition. And unfortunately, what we did find was that there was reduced soil carbon, uh, reduced rate of decomposition. And even after you um, retained your leaves for a year, we still didn't see that kind of bounce back. So there's that legacy effect, unfortunately. That's not to say don't keep your leaves because there's no point. It just means on the soil side of things, it's going to take longer, unfortunately.
You can make a difference for the critters, but it takes longer for the soil itself to rebound. Sounds
Right.
kind of like planting an oak tree. And
Yeah,
the best time to plant an oak tree.
yeah. It's a long-term investment, at least from the soil point of view. But I do think it's important and something that we really need to think about. In urban areas, there's a huge push to grow the canopy, the tree canopy. Some localities have canopy cover goals. In Maryland, we have like million tree plan, different things like that. And that's super important, but we also need to consider what's going on at the ground level, at the forest floor. So not only do we need to, grow our urban tree canopy, we need to grow our urban forest floor.
But they kind of go hand in hand, really,
Absolutely.
too. I mean, if we are putting more trees up there, you're going to have more leaves in the fall. We're already creating the mechanism. Now we just have to do the social change
Yeah.
to look at and realize that, okay, the fall foliage industry is millions at least dollars for tourism every fall. Nobody goes into the woods and thinks, oh, this is so ugly because I've got all these leaves on the
Right.
ground. We love that. So why can't we bring that beauty and that same thought process to our homes, to our neighborhoods? And yes, we need to keep the leaves off the sidewalks and off the street because that becomes a safety hazard. But there's so many places that in our yards that we could still leave the leaves. So again, you can have that both ways. There's that compromise that still
Yeah.
works.
And it also it saves a ton of money. So, I mean, of course, the cost of removing leaves and processing those leaves is huge. I think we remove like around, I think the number's like 35 million tons of yard waste, um, that ends up in landfills. That's the same amount of like municipal plastic waste that we produce. So it's a huge amount of material. And paying to store it, to remove it, to have to rake it or blow it. If you're using a blower, of course, then we have pollution concerns, noise pollution as well. But also just by improving the health of our soil, we have economic impacts. We're not wasting money throwing street trees into the ground one after another and then just dying because they have nothing to hold on to. By creating that soil, even if it's in our medians or strips, we can increase the likelihood that those trees will survive.
And then, I mean, that still spirals out because you don't have to fertilize if you're going to try and keep them alive. You don't have to, like you said, waste the time. I mean, time is money. We're all too busy nowadays. You don't have to use that time to rake or blow. I mean, the benefits just keep going out and out.
Yeah, and right now a lot of people are concerned about flooding, especially in areas with a ton of impervious surface. And improving the health of our soils reduces flooding. If our soils are less compacted, they're able to hold more water, that has a huge impact. You know, if you have really compacted soil, it's better than concrete and asphalt, but it's still not great. Still, a ton of water is just going to wash off. So, that's another thing to think about.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many benefits here. But looking at the practical side again, because I know this is a question I get a lot, is okay, I left my leaves. Now it's spring. When can I remove the leaves?
Hmm.
And I know what my answer has always been to that question, but it was based again on observation and logic, not on scientific data. Um, did your research kind of give us maybe some
Yeah.
hints at that answer from a scientific standpoint?
So, our leaf litter manipulations were done in the fall. So, we didn't change when we did that, but we did collect insects uh, throughout the spring into early summer. And what we found was that there really was no time period when insect emergence just kind of went off. They just kept on emerging. And that's because these insects have different life cycles. Some of them come out first thing, some of them a little bit later in the spring. Some of them then will come out, maybe in June or July. And then some of them have multiple emergences. They have multiple generations within one season. So um, there really isn't a great time to remove that habitat because it's being utilized all year round. I know there have been things like, oh, when the soil hits this temperature or this many days after a frost. We weren't finding that in our studies.
Right. And did your studies take into account, or did they kind of exclude everything that moves back into that leaf litter throughout the different seasons as well?
Right. And I would say keep everything as long as you can. Um, you know, you do want to have some maintenance. If you, let's say you have like a meadow, um, you do want to make sure that meadow stays a meadow and doesn't have trees or things growing in it. Um, so if you have to mow it like once a year, but really that's not really an issue for most people with backyards because we don't really have the room for a meadow.
Right. But yeah, I mean, even with just looking at the leaf litter itself, I mean, there's moths and stuff that use the leaf litter as adults during the what we consider the growing season, the spring, summer, fall. Um,
Absolutely. And that's a great point because there's um, these kind of life history cycles aren't always super black and white. So, like, there are a good number of moths that, as caterpillars, they actually eat decaying leaves. So they're decomposers. And that was when I learned about that, that was so cool. I was like, you always think of caterpillars eating like green leaves on trees, but yeah, there's all these caterpillars that eat decaying leaves. So during the summer, by removing that, it's not just a winter issue.
yeah, and that's one of the things that I think we tend to forget, and we just view leave the leaves as being a winter thing because yeah, that's when you hear about it. It's the fall, and by the time spring gets here, we're all about green things and pretty flowers and
Yeah,
growing, and we forget the value of those leaves that we left. It continues, and that's something that yeah, I forgot about and wasn't even thinking about for a long time myself. And then all of a sudden I realized I was like, oh, wow, duh. Of course, because yeah, I mean, you're always seeing things using them. You've got so much good detail and data here that really helps to fill out this question and provide perspective to something that has really become a driving force for the last decade or so.
yeah.
It's really been increasing, I think.
I've definitely seen just kind of the movement increase as well. Yeah, I think really it's about getting the information out, especially to people who don't really think about. It's great to talk with you, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners. But yeah, to be able to reach out to folks who they have like the pristine green lawn and it's got pesticides and everything on it. That would be the once we can do that, I think we're set.
Yes, but I think we're getting there. I mean, it's baby steps, sure, but I think we're starting to make there's more and more people that are getting concerned,
Right.
that are wanting to do something, and especially when it's something that's relatively easy to do, and it's something that you don't have to do everything on. I mean, you were looking at 1 square meter. That's 3 foot by 3 foot. That's put your arms out in an L and then box it in. And that's how big of an area we're talking about. And that was getting thousands of new insects
Right.
and spiders.
Right.
Yeah, that was making a huge difference right there.
And there's also, as you said, there's this social element to it. And I think there's a taboo in a lot of areas about what your yard is supposed to look like. So the more people that break that taboo and show that I left my leaves, no big deal, it's okay. Then your neighbors will say, gosh, I'm really tired. I don't have time to get out and rake. And look, my neighbor didn't. So what's the big deal?
Right.
And or you have a native plant garden in your front yard and it's like, oh, actually that's beautiful, maybe I'll do that. So it's these types of like little observations that we're always comparing ourselves to other people.
Yes, exactly. And like I said, those are baby steps. It's one person meets one person, but those little sparks, those little baby steps can ignite and catch fire. And all you have to do is get to the tipping point. And I think we're making progress to that.
Especially when it comes to insects. Working or being able to work with homeowners to connect our different habitat types and our wild areas together is just so important. And so, you know, what you're doing in your backyard has applications to, the endangered species that there's like only five of them, you know. So that's a lot of what I think about in my job now is like, how can we increase and preserve these really rare populations of different species? And when you're in an urban state like I am in Maryland, really being able to work with homeowners, with private landowners to manage their land in a way that will allow for those populations to flourish is a huge priority.
Yes. And especially when we're talking about insects, too. I mean, many of the bumblebees that are now being proposed for listing, those are species that we could easily have and be able to support in our yards,
Absolutely.
assuming that you're within an area that has them. But I
Absolutely.
mean, I know like in my own backyard, I've seen several of them
Yep.
and have decent population numbers of them. But it's because of the habitat work that we're doing on our property. And this is something that anybody can do, no matter how big or small your property size is you can provide these little areas and these little stepping stones that, like you said,
Yeah.
can
Stepping
provide that
stones. Exactly.
connectivity. Thank you so much for being a guest on the Backyard Ecology podcast and for sharing your story with our listeners. This was really great.
Absolutely.
And I will have links to your articles and the show notes for anybody that wants to really dig into the science and read those as well. But thanks a lot and have a great day.
Thank you.
If you would like a summary of Max's research and some actionable steps that you can take in your own yard, then check out the bonus content link in the show notes. As always, I want to thank our patrons and other financial supporters who go above and beyond to help us produce free content focused on creating thriving backyard ecosystems that you can enjoy and be proud of. And if you would like to learn more about fall garden care, check out this video and don't forget to take some time to enjoy the nature in your backyard.